Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Sunder Katwala. I'm the Director of British Future, and today's event is organised by British Future on behalf of the Together Coalition. It's part of a project called Talk Together, which we hope will be one of Britain's biggest ever public conversations on what unites us, what divides us, what can bring us closer together in times like these. And we've got a great panel to kick that discussion off today. You'll also participate by sending us your questions and comments on this webinar. The other thing we'd like everybody taking part today to do is to just take 5 minutes to fill in the open online survey that is at together.org.uk. We've already had nearly 60,000 people take part in this, so we're keen for you all to take part in it, you to share it with other people, so we'll get a really big snapshot of what people are worried about, hopeful about, and what they want to see happen. And Talk Together will be getting right round the country. It will be going to every nation, to every region. It will be talking to civic society groups. It will be talking to the general public. We've been doing quite a lot of that online. We're raring to go with doing that in the real world as well when it's safe to do so. We'll be in Yorkshire shortly to start that and coming everywhere. So do ask us as well and talk to us about what's going on in your region, in your area, because we're very much hopeful that many of you will want to help us by hosting more conversations and spread this. And so by the time we've engaged in the real world, we've engaged online, we've held lots of discussions, by about January, we'll be in a position to tell people now, 2020, 2021, where are people, how do views of what's uniting and divide us change, and importantly, what do people want to be involved in that can help us build a kinder, more connected society. That's what this is all about, and we've got a really good panel today to help us kick off that discussion with their personal thoughts about their hopes and fears for the future. This whole Together coalition arose out of a lot of people being worried about the condition of the country. On New Year's Day, many of us were part of a public letter saying we need this to be a decade of reconnection in our society. None of us had heard the word COVID when that happened, so that was a really important thing before we'd heard of COVID. I think COVID and the pandemic has changed the context a great deal. It's changed our society, it's changed our economy, it's changed our lives. It makes all of that more important than ever, but in a very different world from the one we thought we were living in. So that's why we think it's a really important moment to find out why people are. Before I introduce the panel to you and get them to kick off this discussion, we just want to experiment with you, the audience, by asking you just to answer a couple of questions on your screen that will be coming up now. So if the first question could go up: has coronavirus as a whole made the UK more united and more divided? You can go for in the middle. It's on balance. It'll obviously be a bit of both, but show us your views there just by clicking the button as to where you are on whether we're more united or more divided after COVID. And I think we'll give you a few seconds, and I think we'll be shown what you think. Can we see the result of that one? Somewhat more united, just edging it there, 47-34. This is interesting because we've been tracking this, and among the public, somewhat more united was a landslide winner 3 weeks in to the pandemic, and it's now pretty even Stevens between the public. The public's been getting more and more pessimistic, but it's pretty much tied at the moment. You're still holding on to a half full glass here today, so that's a positive thing, but obviously you can see both sides of the question. And last question for the start, we just want to know, it will pop up in a moment, of the choices we're giving you, which would you choose? Which would you choose as the most concerning divisions? You might be worried about all of them, you might be not worried at all about some of them, but make a choice and let's see what pops up top of the list right now. all had a chance to decide there. We'll be shown some results, I hope, soon. And that goes down. Divisions between rich and poor, divisions between people from different ethnic groups, divisions between generations, different religious beliefs. Oh, these aren't. So the political beliefs are third. So rich and poor and ethnic groups. That's quite similar audience. You're not a perfectly representative audience of the British public in lots of other ways. Lots of you work on those issues, but you've got the same top priority right now that the public had when we last looked at this in June. But this is changing all the time and is obviously different nations, different regions, and so on. So thanks very much for participating in that exercise. It shows us that we've got a mix of views in the room, got a mix of views on the panel. I'll just introduce you all to them before they kick off. Iain Dale is a broadcaster and writer. He might be trying to tell us he's got a book out at the moment as well, with that very fine backdrop. And why can't we all just get along? It's something we're hoping to contribute to. But obviously, Iain has written the book because there's a sense that we're not all getting on brilliantly. We've lost the art of disagreeing better, perhaps. Elizabeth Connelly is the programme director of Near Neighbours, which works in diverse areas of the country, bringing together people across different ethnic, faith and class divides to talk about how to build relationships, how we live together in our communities. Kezia Dugdale is the director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow. She's an ex-politician, a recovering politician who can now get above the fray a bit of those debates across the United Kingdom, in Scotland as well, about the society and the big choices that we face. And Kwame Kwei-Armah is the artistic director of the Young Vic Theatre. He's a member of the Together Coalition steering group, as Kezia is as well. He's been very involved as one of our leading playwrights here. He's also spent some time in the US in his career as a theatre director and a culture maker, so can bring us that perspective. Iain, I'm going to ask you to kick off. What do you fear is dividing us? What can bring us together?
Well, thanks very much, Sunder. Right, we've all got 5 minutes. I'm going to try and fit 3 different points into my 5 minutes. The reason I wrote the book was because I've become very disillusioned about the state of our public discourse. It's been that way for quite some time. The internet has been a great thing in bringing democracy to people. It's democratized the media in many ways, but it's also allowed people with very evil intentions to get a platform. And so, I mean, I've always prided myself in getting on with people who hold different political views from me. Kezia and I first met online when we were both bloggers back in the 2000s, coming from very different perspectives. But I think the media is one of my fears, in that if the media doesn't adapt to a new environment, particularly some of the big media organizations, I fear that these divisions are going to increase over the next few years. That's not my main fear, though. I think we don't know how COVID is going to turn out in terms of a dramatic recession. I think if we have maybe one of the biggest recessions in the world, I think that's going to be really awful in terms of the divide between rich and poor, because whenever there is a recession, it is the poorest people in our society that get hit the most. They become even more disillusioned. They search around for people to blame, quite understandably, and there will be people to blame. So at the moment, you've got a Chancellor of the Exchequer who's probably, in many ways, one of the most popular chancellors that I can remember in my adult political life. But you're always popular when you're handing out the sweeties. It's when he brings in the measures that talk about how we have to repay the debt, bring the borrowing requirement down, that is when we're going to see a little bit of pain. And who he puts that pain on is, I think, going to, in many ways, determine how our society is either becomes more divided or unites in the future. Now, he's not going to do, a chancellor can never do anything that everybody agrees with all of the time, but in the end, he's got to try and not just look at it from a financial point of view. He's got to look at it from a societal point of view, and how we can actually keep our society together. Now, there are two other things that I think that I fear could cause a lot of division over the next few years. One is the continuing Brexit debate. I had actually thought that the country was starting to heal after what I think was the most divisive few years in politics that I can remember, where I could not believe the entrenched attitudes that were taken by people on both sides of the debate, where it was almost as if the other side didn't have a right to a point of view. And I've always, part of what I talk about in the book is that if you don't actually accept that the other side have a legitimate argument and you make no attempt to understand that argument, inevitably, you're not going to be able to argue against it very well yourself. Being able to debate properly involves understanding the other side's argument. And we've developed over the last, I would say, 10 or 20 years, in a way where we are all in our individual silos, where we like to hear people agreeing with us. You see this on Twitter all the time. And certainly on Brexit, I think that really came to the fore. Now, if there is no free trade agreement at the end of the year, and I still think there will be, but if there isn't, there is again scope for division there, where people on the Remain side will say, well, I told you, we got it right, and the queues at Dover and all the rest of it. And I think that will be a big cause for division. The other one is obviously what might happen in Scotland. Now, I'm quite unusual for somebody on the right in that I have quite a lot of sympathy with the idea of Scottish independence. I think if you support Brexit, how on earth you can't support the right of the Scottish people to determine their own future, I don't know. But I think that could actually be far more divisive for the whole of the United Kingdom than the 2014 referendum actually was. And it's no good the unionist side of the argument just coming forward with a project fee. I mean, that worked so well in the Brexit debate, didn't it? They've actually got to articulate the positives for Scotland staying in the United Kingdom. But I could never actually support the SNP because they're far too left-wing for me generally. But the idea of Scottish independence, I don't think that people can just dismiss out of hand, whether it's people in Scotland who want to continue with the Union, or whether it's people in England who are keen to keep going with the United Kingdom. So I think that there are all sorts of scope for division. I do think the country has united a bit over COVID. I wasn't surprised by the poll scores that you had there. Certainly in the early months, I mean, everyone's got the same objective. And I think you found lots of communities coming together and neighbours talking to each other in a way that they just hadn't done before. And I think that actually does bring people together and ensures that we can all just get along.
Thanks very much, Iain. There was, I think, certainly that sense of a shared experience, especially early on, and that may be fragmenting more now. Elizabeth, over to you. You've been working, on the ground for a long time. What do you hope unites and fear divides us going forward now?
Yeah, thanks, Sunder. So yes, near Neighbours, we work with very small community groups, grassroots organisations, faith communities, and our aim is to bring people from different backgrounds together so they can get to know each other, build relationships of trust, and collaborate together on initiatives that improve their local community. And we've been working in some neighbourhoods, town cities in England since 2011. So a few opening remarks. I'd like to quote the writer Arundhati Roy. She said that the virus is like an X-ray or an MRI scan. It's exposed bare bones, amplified weaknesses, injustices, racisms, casteisms. And I think that's quite interesting because I think it has shown us the best and the worst of human nature. So it's shown us the importance of human connection, neighborliness and kindness, the importance of key workers who are not valued in our society, care workers, delivery drivers, shop staff, prison officers, those who work in childcare, very poorly paid, looked down on. It's illuminated the economic divide between those who work from home and those who can't, those with job security and those who haven't got that. The digital divide, how many people can't actually access the internet? They don't have the technology, the devices, don't have quiet space in the house, they don't have broadband connection, they rely on very expensive data to their phones. And of course, the continuing inequality for people who are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds in our society. They're much more likely to live in densely populated areas, much more likely to have poorly paid work, to have front-facing jobs, and therefore more likely to catch COVID-19, to not have a garden, to have poorer health outcomes, and so on. So a light's been shone on some really serious issues for our society. As Iain said, we've seen some tremendous positives: strengthened community spirit and belonging, Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, neighbourhood groups, street groups, people working across divides of ethnicity, class, age. And I'll give you an example: the Sri Guru Ravidas Sangha in Luton, Sikh group, giving thousands of meals to key workers, to other faith communities. In Peterborough, mosques working with corner shops, taxi companies and local churches to donate food parcels to the elderly and to those who are shielding. The Hindu community cooking hot meals for those who are homeless and temporarily housed. In Bradford, Hindus and Muslims together working with African Caribbean people, taking out food, hot food and food parcels to lots of different communities. So that's been absolutely fantastic. But we have a number of concerns about what's going to now divide us. That goodwill is dwindling as people go back to work. And we can't have initiatives that are completely siloed. People need to be connected together. Otherwise, it's just duplicated effort. We're going to have such a serious economic impact now, with a precarious financial situation that we're going to be facing after all this money's been spent, and continuing unemployment rising is going to be a reality, unfortunately. And obviously that's going to have a knock-on effect on other things like food poverty, debt, mental health. People already burdened with debt prior to the pandemic falling deeper into debt. And as Iain says, that does actually put pressure on communities because people start blaming each other. And unfortunately, we've now seen that the tensions between different groups and communities that were temporarily transcended in the early months of lockdown are now surfacing and potentially deepening. So in lots of areas where we work, there's a lot of finger pointing and blaming for people from different communities for spreading the virus. So for example, videos showing mosques full of people, which probably taken months ago, pretending to be current. We've got a lot of distrust of the government and local authorities around track and trace, test and trace. People don't want to give the phone numbers. There's the husband of a Norwich MP saying now there's no virus, it's all a conspiracy. And a circulating video in Urdu saying to Muslim communities, don't send your children to school because they'll be taken away from you by the government if they look ill. So a great deal of mistrust, a great deal of tension, and people not really trusting in authorities. And this is across all communities in my experience. So one of the things that's been good is the light that's been shone on inequalities around racism in our country and the way that Black and minority ethnic communities face barriers that white people do not face. But there's a risk now that will just fall off the agenda because Brexit and the economic recovery are going to take priority. So some solutions that I can see: we've seen the importance of the voluntary sector, faith communities and activities to support communities. If local authorities want to really capitalize on that, they need to engage with local communities, they need to listen to them. We need local forums for people to come together to identify solutions and build trust and be able to raise issues of concern and be heard. We need two-way dialogue between policymakers and communities. And there's an important role for organizations that mobilize local people, that build relationships across faith, ethnicity, age, so on, and that actually get people working together. And to be honest with you, I don't think that until now that hasn't really been recognized, and we need more investment in those groups. And the other thing is, if we really want to take seriously issues around racial inequalities, then we need policymakers to develop better ways of listening to communities and investing in Black and minority ethnic leadership, and to find concrete solutions to address the root causes of inequalities, you know, healthcare, education, employment, criminal justice. We need action, not just talk. That's what I'd like to say, Sunder.
Thank you, Liz. And I think this key question will come back to about illuminating divides that were already there, but maybe exacerbating or creating new ones as well. Kezia, what's your sense of what could divide and unite us now?
Afternoon, Sunder, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. My name's Kezia Dugdale. I'm the director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow. If you don't know what we do, we exist to make the positive case for politics and public service, and we try and do that in three ways: through research, and I'll talk about some of that in a second. It's through our advocacy work and through providing high quality, well-paid internships for young people to break down the barriers they face accessing public life. I want to talk about trust today, and I want to, and it follows on neatly on from Liz's comments there actually. I want to focus specifically on the public's attitudes towards the people that govern over their lives and the institutions which govern over their lives. And what unites us, Sunder, is that we're all pretty distrusting of our politicians and our leaders. In a way, the good news is it's always been bad. We've been distrustful of our political leaders since the 1930s. It got worse in 2008, around the time of the economic crash and the MP's expenses scandal, and it got a little bit worse again after the EU referendum, but in many ways, it's not a new phenomenon. The reason why it matters, and this is what divides us, is that that distrust is unequal. So women, young people, and those in low incomes are far more distrusting of the politicians and the institutions in their lives than your average white middle class man. And that's my great fear for the future, is if these gaps between young people and men and women and beyond that get worse, then we're going to see worsening attitudes towards the people that govern over our lives. Why does this matter? Because it's ultimately about the health of democracy, but also there's substantial evidence that says high levels of distrust lead people to feel less willing to obey the law or less willing to expect other people to obey the law. And I think that's an important context when it comes to a pandemic, that we need to be aware of what that really means in practice. So three quick findings from our work that we've published this week. We've just published a trilogy on trust, a report on young people, a report on gender, and a report on the income gap that exists. We would really like to have done a report on Black, Asian, minority ethnic views on trust, but the data wasn't strong enough. And there's a whole other argument there about what we need to do to collect data better for that particular group that I'm sure other people might want to mention or talk about. One, women are far less trusting of politicians and institutions than men are. That is consistent and has been the case for a long time. We need to talk about why that is. When it comes to young people, levels of trust are consistently low right across Europe, but they're worse in Britain than they are elsewhere in the European Union. Interestingly, though, that level of distrust that young people hold isn't stopping them getting involved in political activity, whether that be protests or petitions, and it's also not stopping them voting, particularly in referendums. Young people are disproportionately taking part in the EU referendum and the Scottish independence referendum. There's lots of reasons to explore around why that is the case. The final and I think most disturbing gap is when it comes to income, and we talk about income rather than class, as that seems to be the more prevalent factor coming through the research. And that is that if you earn over £60,000 a year, you're 3 times more likely to trust the government and to believe that democracy is functioning well than somebody who earns between 10k and 20k a year, somebody who's either on a living wage or a minimum wage salary. So that is a huge gap. The bottom line really is, if you're white, if you're middle class and you're well educated, you think the government and democracy is functioning well and in your interest. If you're young, if you're poor, or if you're a woman, you have a very different view. So, Sunder, you asked us for solutions. I have a small one. It's by no means not the whole picture, but I do think we need a concerted effort to make the positive case for politics and public service. We still need people to believe that politics can and is a force for good, and we need to encourage as many people from diverse backgrounds as possible to put their names forward and to stand for office, because the more our leaders look like us, the better position they're in to represent our interests and deliver in our interests. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kez. And I think there's a big issue there in what you say, that, you know, it's a practical challenge for this project as well, Talk Together, that we're very aware of. We want to talk, we want to hear everybody's views, but there's a big gap in share of voice and people's sense of their share of voice. So the gender gap, the generation gap, The class gap on trust is also about those gaps on whether people feel they have a voice, and that gets heard. So that's why we're very keen to talk to lots of organisations about how we make sure we bridge that gap to give a balanced share of voice in the Talk Together exercise. Kwame, give us your sense of what your fears and hopes are at this moment in time.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I don't think I need to say anything. I think everybody just said everything else before me. It's been brilliant. But I would like to agree with a few things that have been said. I'd like to agree with Kez when she talks about politics being a force for good. I think it's really important that we attack the mistrust that sits right at the core of our communities, of our nation, and our mistrust for politicians. I think it's really important that we look at that. But to speak to the things that I worry might divide us, I think the thing I was most angry about during the last Great Recession was that the pundit class didn't tell me that populism depression or recession. It didn't warn me, it didn't warn our population, it didn't speak to us in a way that said, know that this happens, and therefore let's try and not fulfill that stereotype of moving to a place of individualism, to a place of anger, and a place that makes itself manifest in populism. I know that Iain has spoken about leaning to the right, and I speak about, and I would like to speak to that I lean to the left. I see myself as someone who's interested in progressive politics. And of course, it means that we must speak to each other, but there is a way in which we, the pundit class, let our population down. Because I believe in the fundamental good of most people. And that if we were told, resist the urge to blame someone else, resist the urge to get smaller and more insular, resist the urge to view your neighbor through the lens of suspicion as opposed to the lens of commonality, that I believe that we may not have found ourselves, and it's not and that, of course, made itself manifest in our Brexit debate, amongst other things, in our Brexit divisions, amongst other things. Or some might argue the rise of Trump in a different context and the division of hate. I think that what's really important in this winter of discontent that is about to come upon us, that will be felt acutely by the young, who will see aspirations and ambitions disappear before them. That I think the thing that can join us together is if we move away from the tyranny of digital bubbles and move much closer to the empathy that comes from knowing your neighbor. We are a community. Society is made up of communities. It's not rocket science. When I walk down my street and I see homelessness increase, that is, I didn't do that by myself, but together we can find a way to contribute to possible solutions. So I'm actually very optimistic that what we have found ourselves, where we have found ourselves in I won't say post-COVID, but in a midway part of the portal, is that we have discovered that we cannot survive as individuals. And I'm hoping that the project fear that gets made manifest every time we find ourselves in an economic recession or even depression, and not to get too specific, but often many Black people perceive that where the majority of the population are during a recession, we live there normally. And so actually your recession becomes our have to do find our way to hate the sin, but not the sinner. And I believe that what we have just been through possibly points us in the right direction of living together, communicating together, and knowing that we are a community. We are not just individuals.
Thanks, Kwame, for those thoughts. So I'd like to come back to you. We lost a little bit of you on the connection there, but I think we got most of it. Just one question. We're talking about unity as good and division as worrying, and you're saying you lean to the progressive side. There's a case for division, isn't there? Sometimes that if nobody ever divided anybody, you wouldn't make any progress on points that haven't been heard and haven't been talked about. But one person's urgent call for change and passionate call for change is another person's division of society. And I just wondered what your reflections are now on some of the debates we've been seeing in Donald Trump's America on both sides of the debate about race, some of the debates we're having here about race. What is the case sort of for division up to a point, and how do you get that balance right?
I'm sorry, Cindy, I think you cut out. Who was that question?
That was to you, Kwame.
Checking. It's a wonderful question, and I don't know that I believe in division. I might frame it as specificity, culturally specificness. Actually leads us to the universal. What I would say is, I think that what we have seen in the United States, at least from our point of view, our lens, and I tend to speak to American colleagues on a daily basis and lead with, talk to me about what is happening in your country, is that division is short term. No one in their right mind thinks that living in a separate or even provoking division serves your country, your community, or even your. America is having an awakening on race, but America talks about race all of the time. I mean, it just does. I'm really interested in the reflection of race, what's happening in America, in Britain, because we deny race like America denies class, but we are as racist as a nation, institutionally and systemically, as America is. But we just try and hide it through the guise of the delusion of inclusion. And so I find myself very interested in how we as a nation will wrestle our systemic biases and our systemic institutionalized racism and bring us to a place where real and true equality feels achievable in our children's lifetime, if not our own.
Thanks. I'd like to bring Kez in on that as well. I suppose it relates to what you said, Kez, about trust. I mean, some people see these calls for sort of civility and politeness and being polite to people you disagree with as very loaded about the things that they want to say. It sounds like sort of disagree better means sort of don't disagree at all.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I should say is that we should be sceptical of our leaders and our politicians. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I have a problem with it when it's so vastly unequal between different demographics. But you are right, the focus needs to be on disagreeing better than we currently do. And I think that's down to the points about populism and how tribal we've become, which are perpetuated by things like social media, where you join a side, you stick to your own side, you become more convinced of your own righteousness and more convinced that somebody who disagrees with you is not just somebody who disagrees with you, but an enemy. And that's where I think referendums are quite destructive forces. Now, that's quite a controversial point, but referendums force binary choices. They do not allow for consensus to be built or for you to spend any time with the people with whom you fundamentally disagree with. So my solution is not to ban referendums. That's not what I'm articulating. It's simply that referendums are making this worse. And if we keep using them as solutions to very complex problems, binary choices to very difficult issues, then we have to accept that a byproduct of that will always be a more divided society. So that's my tuppence worth on that point. I'll stop before I say any more about Scotland in particular.
We could just hear a little bit about Scotland. I mean, once you've had, I mean, you have British general elections, you have Scottish general elections, you have Scottish referendums, you have UK-wide Brexit referendums. People getting very used to going to the ballot box and being asked, to elect parties, but these very big questions. If there is another very big question in Scotland, like independence, does the experience of having done it so many times before give you any hope for a way of doing it differently, or is it just too high stakes for people to take disagree better seriously?
Painful memories coming to the fore here. I mean, I was leader of the Labour Party through 4 national elections and 1 EU referendum. I was only leader for 2 years. That's how often we have elections in Scotland. There's another one for the Scottish Parliament elections coming in 2021. For people who don't follow Scottish politics that closely, the SNP are miles ahead in the polls, a good 20% point lead on the Conservatives, who are in second place. They're very likely to have a majority in a parliament which is not designed to produce majorities. And a byproduct of that will be that there will unquestionably be a second independence referendum. If you look at current independence referendum polling, there has been a considerable shift from no to yes, around about 5 or 6 percentage points in the last 6 months, really. And when you dig into who those people are, they tend to be people who voted no last time, that are under the age of 40, that consider themselves to be centre-left when it comes to social policy, but want to own their own home, value their pension, want a nice holiday and a car in their driveway. And all the arguments around economic security, which made them vote no last time, have been quashed by Brexit, because they're all predominantly Remain voters who feel very aggrieved by Brexit. So they're now much more inclined to want to see an independent Scotland in Europe than they are to live under a Conservative government led by Boris Johnson. So the debate is shifting in Scotland. It will be polarised because that's what referendums do. And I fear a little bit what will happen in a second independence referendum, because there are mixed views about what the last one was like. I think you had a much more positive experience of it if you were a yes voter, strangely enough, because you found more people like you. There was more of a commonality and a common cause there, whereas the no campaign saw people from Labour and the Tories sitting quite unease or ill at ease with each other, backing what felt like the status quo in a very odd way. So whilst it's good in one way because you find more people like you within your own tribe, you do look at the other with wariness and othering, and I don't know how you overcome that, because I think that's inherently what referendums do.
And Iain, it'd be good to have your take on this. I mean, one of the really interesting features I find about this culture war style debate is that everyone says they're against a culture war, but that it's the other side that has started it, and that they just have to respond. People like me are lovely, but people like them, they make it very divisive, and vice versa, because we're talking to our own tribe about what we feel is going on. How do you break through that?
Well, I think we can all agree, Sunder, you are lovely. Just a word on referendums. The people who don't like referendums are the people that lose them. There wasn't really a debate about whether referendums were a good idea or a bad idea until the Remain side lost the Brexit referendum. So all of the ruling classes who generally voted Remain now hate referendums. Referendums are not bad things. They allow people a say on lots of different issues. In Switzerland and New Zealand, not countries I would associate with populism, they have regular referendums. Many states in the United States have them very, very regularly. So there's nothing intrinsically bad about referendums, unless, of course, you lose them. I want to just go back to what you were saying, Sunder, about division, because division is a pejorative word. Disagreement, in a way, is a slightly less pejorative word, but humans are individuals, and we are programmed to have opinions, and therefore we are programmed to disagree with other people. And the whole point here is the kind of debate that we have on various issues. Now, people think of talk radio hosts as shock jocks. And it's the first line of my book. This is a question I'm most asked. Oh, so you're a shock jock then? Well, no, I'm not. I regard my role actually as to have proper debate and actually try and bring from an understanding between sides. And yes, sometimes arguments do get very passionate, but they're not there to actually cause division. You might have to reflect the divisions that there are in society. I did a Brexit phone a few weeks ago for the first time in, I don't know, 5 or 6 months, thinking that it would be different from what had gone on before. Oh, how was I wrong? It was exactly the same arguments being put forward on the second referendum and all the rest of it. And at the end of it, I just said into the microphone, I'm really sorry I did this phone in because it wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to rehearse all of the old arguments. We've got to look forward. And that, I guess, is the thing that I would say about all the different issues that we've all raised today. There is no point in having a retrospective. We are where we are. We've got to look forward and think, well, how can we bring people together on all of these different kind of issues? And I agree with Kez, if there is to be another Scottish referendum, we've all got to really look ourselves in the mirror and think, well, how are we going to conduct this referendum? How are we going to have the argument so it doesn't degenerate into some of the slanging matches that occurred in the last one? Now, that may be a vain hope, I don't know. But I think on both sides, people really need to examine their consciences on how they conduct these kind of things. But then again, when you have the professional campaign managers who are going to say, well, negativism works in these campaigns, you've got to have a degree of project fear. I do fear for how it will turn out. I mean, regardless of whether you agree with independence or not, I mean, in Scottish terms, I think that the aftermath of that could be far more divisive than anything that COVID can bring and anything that Brexit can bring.
Thanks, Iain. We're looking for you to put your questions in the Q&A box so that I can put some of your questions as well to the audience. We've had Chris Cregan asking about whether shifting the balance between representative democracy and participatory democracy can help us build trust, which is one of the things that we've been talking about here. Some people are very in favour of participatory democracy, but not referendums. Other people think referendums can be part of that. Another question we've had, Warwick Hawkins has asked us, does the panel feel that phenomena like no platforming and identity politics are good for community cohesion or bad? And Elizabeth, I'd like to bring you in on that question, but also the broader point here. Identity politics is also a sort of pejorative term for people expressing their identity in different ways, although we might then all say that gay pride's very good or Martin Luther King's brilliant, that's good identity politics. But this no platforming is obviously about the boundaries. Where is the boundary between you know, the disagreement you have to have and what's extreme and toxic, and identity politics? And of course, this is one of the things that we can disagree about as well as agree on.
Yeah, so this is a difficult one because I don't think there's anything wrong with holding strong opinions which are different from other people's. And for example, you know, I might have very strong Christian beliefs, but it doesn't stop me recognizing, respecting, and working with someone, one of my colleagues, who's very strong Muslim beliefs. I think a lot of the issues we have in society is people don't actually talk to each other, they don't communicate with each other. And there's lots of people, for example, who've never actually met a Muslim. They don't actually know any Muslims, never spoken to any Muslims except for maybe 2 minutes in a corner shop. So they believe things that they see on social media because they don't have any personal experience to go against that. However, I think we have to stand against people who promote violent extremism, and we shouldn't be on platforms with them. When I was a young person, I worked in an area of London, the Isle of Dogs, where the BNP were elected. And there was no way you could have any kind of conversation with them whatsoever. Iain's book about shouting less and listening more, they hadn't read it because we had a meeting and they all just shouted. And there was no way you could reason with them because they just were so beyond any kind of sensible discourse that it was just absolutely pointless. And if anybody did actually accidentally bump into them, they'd take a picture of you as if you were supporting them, as if you were, you know, promoting them. So you had to kind of quite, you know, socially distance from them so they didn't take a crafty picture while you weren't looking. So I don't think you can stand with people who hold such violent extremist views like the BNP or some of the you know, radical people who are anti-Semitic, for example, because I think that's just a waste of time. What you've got to do is find people that you can have a conversation with, that you might disagree with, but who will listen and you can discourse with and you can communicate with. And I think that's one of the things we need: better communication, more respect, more listening. And that's the way we're going to actually work together. And I'm with Kwame. You know, I'm a positivist. I think we have got a cup half full. People working together can make a huge difference, especially in local communities. And we can all light a candle to dispel the darkness.
Thanks. Iain, it'd be good to get your view on that. I mean, as you say, your whole ethos is you have to see the other perspective and agree it exists. Elizabeth's saying, obviously, there are some boundaries where you can't see the other point of view. How do we get that line right?
Well, we will all have different lines because we are all human beings. We'll all have individual definitions of that. Elizabeth, I actually lived on the Isle of Dogs during that by I was the agent for the Conservative candidate, so I remember all of that very well. But the point that you made about, I think, was it you or was it Kezia, about individuals versus groups is really well made, and the point you made about Muslims, somebody I know not that long ago said to me, "Oh, we've got a Muslim couple moving in next door." I said, "Oh, right, okay." He goes, "Well, I mean, you know." I said, "What do you mean, you know?" "Well, you know." And clearly he thought he got terrorists moving in next door. A couple of weeks later, we had another conversation. I said, "Oh, how are you getting on with your neighbours?" "Oh, lovely people. We were in and out of each other's houses all the time." And this is where, when we refer to groups as Muslims, as asylum seekers, as immigrants, as refugees, it kind of dehumanizes people. And everybody is an individual. And when you talk to an individual, when you talk, say, for example, I did a phone in some months ago where I asked so-called illegal asylum seekers to phone in and tell me their story. Why did they come to this country? How did they get here? What have they done since? And it was the most marvelous hour. I got a lot of criticism because people said, well, you shouldn't be sort of inviting people on to talk about these things. But every single person had actually got a really positive story to tell. And at the end of the hour, I said to the listeners, I said, look, you and I would have made exactly the same decision in their, if we were them, in their circumstances. They made the right decision for them and their families to come here. And since then, there's one guy who was employing 50 people. They'd all regularized their position. And all I wanted to do in that hour was to try and make people think, well, these are human beings. They're not numbers. They're not sort of 400 people came across the channel today. There are 400 individuals with stories to tell. And this is where the lines blur nowadays between left and right. And I suspect Kwame would have a lot of sympathy with what I've said. He self-describes on the left, I self-describe on the right. But these left-right lines don't really exist in the way that they did maybe in the 1980s.
I'd like to come to Kwame on that. I'll just give you another comment as much as a question that we've had that is on the same theme before we bring Kwame in on this theme. Neil Denton says, conflict's inevitable. Conflict isn't negative or positive. It's the energy for change. It's how you manage that. And that what COVID has done is promote a lot of in-group bonding, more connection with people we know, but maybe less inter-group connection. So do we need to put more processes in place to reinforce commonality of need, intergroup collaboration, common interests? If we don't do that, we will see more destructive conflict. I think that's very similar to Elizabeth's point that if you're disagreeing with people you've never met, Iain's anecdote there about, you know, what you think about Muslims moving in if you've never met a Muslim. So maybe that's one of the ways to make the disagreement more manageable, that you've met the person in the real world you disagree with. Kwame, what do you think we can actually do about this conflict being constructive, not destructive?
I'd like to affirm that whoever it was that framed that we've had less intergroup connectivity. I'd affirm that, and I think that we know how to work that, don't we? We need to get over project fear of COVID. It is frightening, but we also need, when we're walking down the street, I mean, even at a basic level, and you know, during the heart of it, you would see someone walking towards you, and they would step away and now I'm a little bit more eye contact, people as we navigate our spaces. I think it's going to be really important that we interconnect in a far more almost aggressive way. I'd like to also agree with Iain in that I think the binaries of left and right are old-fashioned and no longer really exist. People move from fiscal to social positions all over the place, and I think only people who really want to sit in the dogma of the 19th and 20th century really link everything about their being to a hard position of left or right. It's far more fluid than that. But I'd like to just point, and forgive me for doing this, I'd like to just throw a little, what certainly is for me, a little bomb into this. And that is, and it probably isn't a bomb at all, and we probably all agree, but there seems to be a theme here about conversation is king or queen. Just if we talk to each other. I don't believe that. I believe that there is toxicity to privilege, and there are privilege where there are and position, and the context of a conversation is everything. I remember my mother, who was an immigrant into this country, would often say, you know, sometimes when white people speak to me, and they speak to me as if I'm slightly less, I have the conversation and I let the conversation play out because I play fool to catch wise. And it was a huge lesson for me to understand that metaphor, playing fool to catch wise, in order to achieve this thing that I wanted to get out of this conversation. And so I think it's really important that we don't just sit in this kind of airy fairy land of let's just talk to each other and mix with each other more. Actually, it's about quality of listening. It's about deprivileging. It's about decolonizing our minds and decolonizing our privileges, so that when we enter conversations, whatever position we enter into, and there should always be different positions, we enter into it as equals, deprivileged.
Thanks, Kwame.
With someone who's the nice face of the
Kwame, you were breaking up a bit there, but I think I got the gist. I hope most people got the gist of that. Talking isn't enough. Talk together needs to understand that if you just tell people to talk, come along and talk and go away happy, it might work for some people. Other people will be very frustrated about that. So that was Kwame's challenge on that, and I think that's an important challenge. We want to work together. Obviously, there's an element of catharsis if you haven't been allowed to have your say, but this is about talking about what we need to do, and it might be about what the government needs to do, but sometimes it might be about what we need to do in our street, in our towns, in our communities. Another question on a similar theme, Miriam from More in Common. She says, there can be differences that don't turn into divides. The generations have different opinions. There isn't yet a big intergenerational divide among the general population, she suggests. What are the best ways to ensure differences don't turn into divides? What gives you hope? Kez, do you want to say something about that, or the rest of the conversation we've been having?
Yeah, sure. And I'm frustrated I couldn't hear everything Kwame was saying, because I think he was making some really critical points there. I was kind of desperate to agree with him and hear more of it. I mean, I think what he was basically saying was there's no point in listening to people if you're not prepared to act on what you hear. And I think that's also an answer to Chris Cregan's question about, is participatory democracy the answer? What do we mean by that? We mean things like citizens' juries, empowering people. It means community budgeting and giving power away, giving power and agency away. And that's the only thing that's fundamentally going to change this and shift attitudes. And that's why we're so obsessed at the John Smith Centre with keeping the belief that politics and public life is a force for good is so important, and why we're desperate to diversify the people who go in to these positions of power and influence, because it's only when the people with power understand that progress can only be made if they share or give away some of their privilege that any progress will be made is such a key part of this conversation.
Thanks. Elizabeth, I'd like to put a connected question to you that's come in. Ruth Cadbury says she's a member of Parliament, and she's saying that the towns she represents in West London, Brentford, Isleworth is her area, are all highly diverse in all senses. People of different faiths and ethnicity are relatively well connected, but as somebody who's linked to many community networks online and not, she thinks there are two sets of communities that don't really touch each other, not divided by ethnicity and faith, but by class and income and tenure. And while we talk about the income divide and the political solutions needed, we're nervous to talk about class in the context of community and neighbourhood solutions. She wants to know if the panel agree with that, but also what we do about that.
Yes, I do agree with that. I think there is a divide between class and also between rural and urban. I actually live in a rural village, but I do a lot of my work in urban areas, and I think there is a tremendous divide there. We run a program near Neighbours called Real People Honest Talk, and how that works is we have 3 sessions with local neighbourhood groups coming together in a facilitated conversation to talk about things in their area that concern them, and also what they can begin to do about some of them and how they can work together. And that ends in a big conversation where people are able to speak to members of parliament or local councillors or people from the health service, people making decisions that affect local people. And we find that often people have never had a chance to speak to their local councillor. They won't dream of going and turning up at a council meeting or speaking to, their local MP, because they don't think anyone would bother listening. So empowering people to be able to speak to people in power is actually really positive, because it enables both sides to hear one another and people to think about what really matters and what can make a real difference. And very often there are a few simple things that can happen, but people in power just don't know what would make a big difference. For example, a new bus stop near an elderly care home. People can't walk a long distance. They need a shelter over the bus stop to stop them all getting wet. They need more youth centres in their community because youth got nothing to do and they're all bored, and they're called antisocial behaviour. There's some very small steps often that can make a huge difference in a local community. And I think one of our problems is people don't talk across that divide between communities, because unfortunately the people often who end up being your local councillor are your privileged white middle class people who can afford to do a part-time job where there's a meeting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon till 8 o'clock, or who've got the time to spend in council meetings. And people who are more disadvantaged have got children at home, they're working 3 jobs, they're not able to participate in the way that we run society. So we have to actually facilitate more of that and get people in local community forums talking together with people who make decisions.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And if others want to come in on that, let me know. Iain, can I put a different question we've had to you and see if you've got something to say about this? A number of questions are about the uses of populism, and people mean different things by populism, and the use of populism by people in power. And one of those questions from Teresa Norman says she's very worried by one of the articles in the Sunday papers, which said that this government takes pride in breaking the rule book. And she says, rules help keep us safe and mean that we have proper processes in government. We obviously see that on a different scale entirely, I think, probably in the United States as well. What's your sense about that sense that sort of being in favour of breaking the rules to be popular is part of the danger here?
I don't know what the article is that's being referred to.
It was by Andrew Rawnsley, it's mentioned, but the government sees that as a popular thing to be seen to be doing.
I mean, I don't really know how to answer that. I think populism is seen as a very negative word, but I think it's seen as a negative word by many people who actually don't seem to understand where it's come from. And let me preface my remarks by saying that I'm as anti-Trump as I think probably everybody else on this panel. But I think you have to understand where the Trump support came from in America, and where the support for not all of the support, but a lot of the support for Brexit came from in this country. And I don't view the word populist as negatively as probably everyone else in this discussion, because I kind of understand that people who are disillusioned will look for a different solution. And in America, Washington has been seen as a dirty word for a very, very long time, and Washington politicians haven't really done anything to promote any kind of meaningful reform. So Trump comes along as, I mean, portraying himself as anti-establishment, which is a bit of a joke when you think what his background is. But he managed to convince people that he wasn't like the rest of them. Farage did that to an extent in this country as well, probably with more reason than Trump. And so Trump can then pick up on any little statistic that proves that he's been successful. So he will pick on, for example, the fact that unemployment among Black Americans is lower, I think, than it's ever been, or what certainly was until COVID. So he will pick on that as an example of how he's done something for the very people who are angry with the system. And I don't think that sort of the ruling classes in this country, particularly not just in politics, but in the media as well, I don't think they've got a clue about why Grimsby voted the way it did in the general election. I don't think the Labour Party has got the faintest idea or understanding of why the red wall seats went Conservative at the last election. And until they do try to understand that, they can never actually do anything meaningful to get those voters back, in my view. So you've got to understand why people think the way they do before you can address the issues. And whether we think that Trump has addressed any of them or not, he's doing a damn good job with some people in America to convince them that he has. And although I desperately hope that he doesn't win the election in November, I can kind of see he's on a bit of an upward curve now in the opinion polls, and I think the Democrats have got a bit of a job on their hands now.
I'd like to hear from Kwame as well. But you've spent a lot of time in America, and Kwame's going to try and answer with the camera off, just see if that improves the sound communication for this. But Kwame, your whole work in theatre obviously is about empathy and connection and so on. Whatever you think of Donald Trump, how do you avoid dehumanizing the large sections of the population that feel recognized by him? What's the lesson for you been of the last few years on that?
Apologies, I was muted there. Apologies for my connection. I don't quite know what's going on. But I think I'd like to gently push back on what Iain said. I think he's absolutely right about understanding populism. I think I do understand what it is, and I can still see it in the pejorative. I lived in America, as you've said, in the run-up to Trump, and actually I could see it coming, not because I had a crystal ball, but because I drove to work every day via Uber, and not Uber, the flash Uber, but the very basic Uber. And my taxi drivers or the Uber drivers would speak. I would say, "What do you think about Hillary?" They go, "Oh, she's wicked." I say, "What do you think about Donald?" And they'll be like, "Oh, he's so much fun." And there was a completely physical reaction to the very mention of his name, and we know that led to people who were leaning in. Absolutely right, is that actually what we on the left, we progressives, did was that actually we didn't listen well enough. We thought we had won arguments when we had only won the silence. And my mother used to teach me that all the time. Say, "Kwame, you're good at arguing, but you win the silence and not the argument." And actually, I think that many of us on the left and progressives do actually understand that we didn't listen well enough. And and when people are ignored, people create a different world for themselves where they have power. So actually, I think the lessons that we need to learn, and that we have learned and is that we need to listen even to those who we disagree with really hard. And that's what we do in theatre. We try to create environments where people can listen to each other, where you can hear that view. The State of the Nation play can tell you the thing that you wouldn't have heard of in your digital bubble. I think where we find ourselves, and I go back to my original point, is the quality of listening that we need to employ during this winter of discontent that's about to come in needs to be deeper than we've ever listened before. Our empathy needs to be larger than it's ever been before. And the joining of hands, once we listen without privilege, needs to be like we have never joined hands before. And I think we can get to a better place. We can get to, quote unquote, a version of a promised land.
Thanks, Kwame. And we had a better quality of listening to you there without the camera. So thank you for that. Kezia, I don't know if you'll be able to get people to join hands right across Scotland in the way that Kwame suggests while there's an election on. But this broader question as well about populism. Is it a useful term now, or has it just become people I don't like who are sometimes doing well?
So we've got evidence which shows the distinct link between low levels of trust and populism. And I want to absorb one of Iain's points and accept that populism isn't necessarily or automatically a bad thing. In fact, when a populist leader becomes an actual leader, then they have a democratic mandate, and to undermine that democratic mandate does its own damage in a way. But I want to make a point more specifically about broken promises and trust. So we've also got evidence that says when a politician breaks a promise, it doesn't actually do them any damage in terms of the standing they have amongst the population. Why? Because the public never expected them to keep that promise in the first place, because trust levels are so low. So that, I think, in a way speaks to the rise of populism, because after years and years of transactional politics, where a politician would say, elect me and I'll do these 5 things, and then those 5 things didn't happen, we created a window where populist leaders could walk into that space and say, don't vote for me because of what I'll do, vote for me because I speak like you, I understand your lives, I'm a different type of leader, and that's the break from the past that I represent. So that's a long way round of saying, if you're in the business of trying to defeat populism, you can't seek to do it solely with rational arguments, because they're the ones which have failed in the past. Populism is a completely different game, which requires both the head and the heart to be talking in a way that's different from what came before. I ignored your point about Scotland there, because like the John Smith Centre is like a UK-wide organisation. I don't want to get solely drawn into the independence argument, but some people will argue that independence is a populist crusade, and other people will say to you, no, independence is the most realistic vehicle for progressive Scotland. So I don't think there's one set view of how that works within the Scottish constitutional question.
Yeah, and it can become, I mean, it can be true of, what people say about Jeremy Corbyn or what people say about the right wing of the Conservative Party, that populism can become politics I don't agree with. People don't tend to say I'm a populist, but so yeah, I think we can have that kind of point. So we haven't got long left. What I'd like to do, we've had several contributions from the audience that are of a similar tone here about what needs to happen. I'd just like to end on what can we do. Just to mention one other comment that's just come in from Noah Chowdhury. About how when we talk to each other, understand the importance of overcoming identity barriers. What will that mean for our faith in democracy if elections and referendums often have this kind of fear, othering of different groups? Is the responsibility for making sure we don't other groups too? Do we put that on the politicians? Is it on us as well as voters and citizens? Is the thrust of that question. But what I'd like the panel just to maybe say in their last remarks, anything else that you haven't had yet. But apart from talking, we're going to talk to people, but we're going to talk to people about what should we do? What should we do together? And also, what do you want to do? Not just what do you want the government to do? What should one of the questions we want to know is what should we decide to do more of together? So as well as talking and meeting, I'd like some just a thought from each of you about the discussion we've had, but something that you'd like to see happen that could be done. Liz, maybe I'd come to you first.
So I'd like to see us working together better in local communities and different people from different backgrounds coming together with local politicians and policymakers to decide on what's best for local communities, because they're the best people, best placed to make local decisions. And in terms of nationally, I'd like to see politicians stop making off-the-cuff remarks which are quite offensive, because that encourages local people in local communities to repeat them or to say things which are not helpful. And yeah, I mean, we had an example of that yesterday from Matt, and about the new trade representative hopefully coming, they think, Tony Abbott. These off-the-cuff remarks are not helpful, are they?
Kwame, what's something that you think we might be able to do when we've talked to each other about what to do?
I'd like to second Elizabeth. I wrote that down as soon as you said it. I'd like to see us working more in our communities, with, for, together in the communities. And on a national level, this might be almost impossible and certainly is a fairy tale, but I would like to see the banishment of fear.
Well, so that's a big ask there. Iain, you've been going around talking about your book, and I'm sure you found that a lot of people agree with you, but find it hard for the people who agree with you to get heard in the shouting match. What do you think we can actually do to change where we're headed?
I think we should all be singing Kumbaya every day. I think that would help the dialogue. Look, there are two things that I'm going to highlight. I think that everyone, whatever their politics, whatever their passions, we all need to dial down the rhetoric sometimes. Inevitably, if you are part of a single issue pressure group, you feel incredibly strongly about your cause, and quite rightly too. But there are ways of getting over your argument, and there are ways of not getting over your argument. Extinction Rebellion, I think, is a prime case here, where when they started, I mean, even wizened old people on the right like me thought, well, you've actually made a really good point here, you've done it well. And now they're just in danger of losing all public support because of the way that they're acting. So dial down the rhetoric, take a little bit of time before you react to people that try and goad you, and don't react on Twitter immediately. Take a few seconds to think about what you're doing. Don't get involved in unnecessary arguments. The other thing I'd like to address very briefly is the gotcha interview. I think the general public saw through this, particularly during the Downing Street press conferences, where you had the big name journalists, virtually all, asking questions designed to get themselves a headline on their own channels. It didn't actually enlighten the public at all. If you ask a minister, aren't you ashamed, minister? Why don't you resign, minister? What do you expect to happen? Do you expect them to say, oh yeah, actually, no, I think I will? Oh, you're not going to get an answer, and they know that before they ask questions. And the great questions in those press conferences all came from the regional and local journalists, because they were doing their jobs. And I think the big name journalists in the media need to look themselves very closely in the mirror and look at what they're doing. It's not about them, it's about the people that they're serving, and they're not serving them very well at the moment.
Thanks, Iain. Kez, from talk to action, what would you like to see happen on this front?
One of the things I'm hopeful for, or one of the things that I really hope is the good that comes from this awful pandemic, is the resurgence of big ideas. Because actually I think there's a huge amount of permission from the public and willingness to give leaders in lots of ways the space to do things differently from what came before. And I think the pandemic has exposed a lot of problems that we haven't been grappling with as a society, or as politicians, or as leaders in our own field. We've proven that we can end homelessness literally overnight by opening up our hotels. We've proven that we can care for a nation. So why is it not time for a national care service? So if anything, I think there's positivity and hope in the big idea coming to the fore again. And I actually think big ideas are a big part of people rebuilding faith in participating in democratic processes. If there's something to vote for, if things are really going to change, then I think we'll see more people willing to be a part of that democratic process.
Thanks.
Sunder, I'm so sorry. Could I just say one thing? Can I just talk about the lyrics of Kumbaya? And I would say that You know, if you take the religiousness out of that, it says, "Come by here, my Lord, come by here." Someone's singing, someone's crying, someone's praying. Please come by here. Talking about as a nation is we're thinking about how we get to a place of healing. We're thinking about how do we get to a place of togetherness? How do we get to a place where the world that our children inherit is better than the world we have now? So we can all sing Kumbaya, and we can look at it in the pejorative, or we can look at it as come by here, goodness. And I think that's what we want.
That's a great point to end on, Kwame, because I think we've shown today, despite some technical hitches, that even while we're mostly still in our own homes and getting the children back to school and wondering whether we can go back to the office, we can start this conversation. But to have it properly, we're going to have to come by here all around the country. And so we're very much looking forward to getting actually round, as Near Neighbours does so often, to make sure we're having those real world conversations, not just online conversations. So there are two things the Together Coalition would really like you to do. Take 5 minutes to take the survey, share your views, answer some questions, you know, give us your thoughts on where we are as a country and where we could go, but also do get in touch if you'd like to be part of that, of you know, holding conversations in the real world as well as online, so that we can have as many conversations as possible. So share the survey with other people, but do get in touch with us if you'd like to be part of that, you know, local level discussion that we think can inform this. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thanks to the audience. It'll be great to have events where we can hear you as well as read out what you've had to say, but we've got the conversation going. This is the start of Talk Together, and we need many more conversations, and we need conversations that take us to action. Do get in touch with us if you'd like to be involved with this. Thank you very much, Iain, Elizabeth, Kezia, Kwame, for helping us kick off the conversation today, and thanks everybody for your contributions as well. So that's great, and thanks very much, and have a good day.
Thank you.